Hey guys, welcome to Journey of Relaxation. Tonight we're slipping into the damp green shadow of a Victorian parlor where soft ferns unfurl behind curved glass, and the air smells like moss-damp earth and just a hint of stewed turnip. You're in your stocking feet trailing your fingers along the cool edges of a Wardian case listening to the tick of a mantel clock. Outside, London's thick fog curls like pipe smoke around the gas lamps, and inside everyone is quietly losing their minds over plants. And you probably won't survive this. Because fern fever, also known as pterodomania, is not just a sweet little garden hobby. It's a full-blown obsession. It consumes polite society with the subtle, creeping tenacity of an actual fern root system. What begins as a fascination with fronds will spiral into midnight greenhouse raids, passive-aggressive drawing room battles, and whispery gossip so potent it could rot your begonias. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you're watching. It's always fun to see who else is unwinding with a bit of plant-based chaos. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your journey in early 1800s Britain, where industrial soot is on the rise. Fashionably pale people are crammed into parlor rooms and plant life. That's suddenly the hot ticket to grace, health, and spiritual fulfillment. The Victorians, ever hungry for something to tame and categorize, find their next conquest, not in gold or glory, but in greenery. It starts innocently. You spot a fern while on a countryside stroll. Its lacy leaves are delicate, symmetrical, a little wild, but decorous enough for the breakfast nook. You take it home, maybe press a frond in a journal. A week later, you're buying a second, then a third. Next thing you know, you're hauling back potted Polystichum setiferum in a borrowed carriage, hoping no one notices your soil-stained gloves at Sunday service. Soon, entire books are being published on the moral purity of plants. Ferns, in particular, are praised for their modest elegance, which translated from Victorian means they're leafy and don't have sex organs you can actually see. This makes them the perfect plant for indoor display, unlike, say, orchids, which are far too suggestive for your average maiden aunt. And while ferns may look delicate, they're tough little survivors. In a world of coal smoke and grime, these plants cling to life in shady, damp cracks, making them unexpectedly trendy emblems of endurance and domestic virtue. Sort of the botanical version of "I thrive in low light and emotional neglect." But to keep a fern healthy in 1840s London is no small feat. The soot, the dry air, the clumsy footman, everything's a hazard. Enter Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a man with a name like a Dickens extra, and a head full of greenhouse dreams. He invents what becomes known as the Wardian case, a sealed glass terrarium that creates a mini-climate perfect for your delicate fronds. Think of it as the Victorian version of a humidity-controlled display case for your leafy green babies. Once these little cases hit the market, fern fever explodes. Now you can grow a thriving fern right in your parlor, even if your windows face nothing but your neighbor's chimney and despair. Everyone suddenly wants one. They're status symbols, conversation pieces, love letters to your own good taste. If your house doesn't have a fern in a glass box, people start whispering about your moral character. Probably something dreadful like she keeps geraniums. And yes, historians still argue whether the mania sprang from a genuine passion for natural science, or a socially acceptable excuse to show off your drawing room under the guise of horticulture. You see, the Victorians aren't just interested in plants for plants' sake. They're assigning meaning to everything. A fern isn't just a fern, it symbolizes humility, solitude, and maybe a touch of erotic melancholy if you read the right poetry. And trust me, they do read the poetry. Aloud, with feeling. So now, your life is a loop of carefully misting fronds, adjusting your Wardian case's placement for ideal diffused light, and writing tiny fluttery letters to friends about how your Adiantum capillus veneris has sprouted a new fiddlehead. You throw plant viewing parties. You make scrapbooks. You even attend exhibitions where people show off prize ferns like they're purebred spaniels. A woman in Bath allegedly fainted at the sight of a perfect Dicksonia antarctica, though it's unclear if it was from admiration or corset-induced hypoxia. Meanwhile, the streets of London buzz with whispers. Who has the rarest specimen? Who keeps theirs alive the longest? Who lets theirs get dusty? What starts in the parlor doesn't stay there for long. Ferns creep into the public parks, the cemeteries, even the train stations. There's something soothing about their endless spirals, their lushness in a world increasingly made of soot and brick. They feel like nature's apology letter. But under that calm green exterior, there's a frantic, escalating competition. Because in this society, even something as gentle as a plant becomes a means of climbing or falling down the social ladder. And you, of course, are right in the thick of it. Your hands smell faintly of moss. Your calendar's full of garden club teas and mysterious swapping sessions. Your neighbors are definitely peeking through the hedges to count your fronds. Somewhere in this leafy madness, a thought settles into your mind like a spore taking root. This isn't about ferns. This is about control, about status, about bringing a little chaos indoors and trapping it politely under glass. And your fern? She's thriving. You're standing in the corner of a prim little drawing room watching two ladies in satin gloves silently battle over who will get closer to the Wardian case. The air smells faintly of lemon polish and overwatered soil. The tension is thick enough to snip with embroidery scissors. And that's the thing, when a fern lives indoors, it becomes theater. Wardian cases, those pretty glass and brass terrariums named after Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, have transformed the parlor into a miniature conservatory, and maintaining them requires an almost sacred ritual. The cases are sealed, meant to simulate the climate of a tropical forest, but of course this doesn't stop people from fussing over them anyway. Every visit to the fern is an event, a lifting of the case lid with dainty fingers, a whispered consultation over moisture beads on the glass, a solemn nod over a developing frond. It's like performing open-heart surgery with a doily. And you are deeply invested in the health of your maidenhair fern. You tilt the case toward the lamp in the late afternoon just to mimic a sunset. You tap the glass lightly to dissuade flies. You read aloud to it just in case Dickens helps with spore development. Your cousin thinks you've gone peculiar. You don't care. Victorian society, you realize, thrives on subtlety. In a world of restrictive etiquette and repressed emotions, the act of tending a plant becomes a loophole. You can't storm out of a room without being labeled hysterical, but you can reposition your rival's Wardian case slightly off-center on the mantel and call it helpful. That's the polite woman's version of a slap. And don't be fooled, men are just as involved. While ladies dominate the world of domestic ferns, gentlemen build their own sanctuaries. Drawing rooms become fern theaters. Conservatories bloom with curated specimens. One retired admiral reportedly hosted Wednesday night fern consultations, where men in waistcoats sat around debating moisture levels while sipping brandy and pretending not to be incredibly attached to their polypodiums. Historians still argue whether these social performances were conscious competitions or just the natural outcome of Victorian decorum colliding with chlorophyll. Either way, every movement around the fern becomes loaded. Imagine watching a rival hostess lift the lid of her Wardian case with slightly damp gloves, an unpardonable sin. Moisture equals mold, and mold equals death. There are reports of friendships withering over such transgressions. There's even a tale, perhaps exaggerated, of a marriage proposal being retracted after a man witnessed his fiancée misting her ferns in direct sunlight. Scandalous. And it's not just the care of the fern that matters, it's the artistry of the display. You don't just shove a pot into a case and call it a day. You create miniature scenes, ferns nestled beside shards of mossy bark pebbles arranged like riverbeds, tiny ceramic frogs tucked discreetly among the roots. These are not terrariums, they're living dioramas. One enterprising lady in Brighton allegedly staged a full Gothic narrative within her Wardian case, complete with a miniature ruined abbey, a sorrowful monk carved from bone, and a single dramatically placed Asplenium trichomones. That's commitment. But your favorite bit, it's the talk. No one gossips quite like the Victorian upper crust, and now they've got a leafy excuse. Afternoon visits quickly become fern critique sessions. My dear, is that a polystichum? Oh, brave choice. Some say they sulk indoors, but I suppose one must experiment. Oh, how bold to keep yours in the western window. I hear Miss Pennington tried that, and ended up with drooping margins. Of course her maid is rather inattentive. These people could slice you to ribbons with a comment about your compost, and yet it's intoxicating. In a world where women are told to stay indoors, speak softly, and marry quickly, ferns offer a strange kind of power. You control their world, adjust their weather, decide who gets to admire them. And in the process, you carve out a pocket of independence that no one dares criticize because it's just plants, right? Except it isn't. It's a way to compete, to express taste, to assert control in a society that doesn't always give you much else. And if you happen to overhear that Mrs. Fairchild's prized fern is turning yellow, you don't gloat. You simply raise your teacup, lower your lashes, and say, "How unfortunate. Perhaps it's time she reconsidered her mulch blend." Your own Wardian case is of course immaculate. Visitors peer in as if it contains buried treasure. You once caught a neighbor's maid trying to sketch your arrangement on a scrap of linen. You didn't say anything, you just moved the case to a higher table and pretended not to notice. There's a kind of polite warfare happening here. And honestly, you love it. Even the quiet rituals are satisfying. Lifting the lid with a cloth-covered hand. Checking for condensation patterns on the inner glass. Placing a single small snail shell beside the base of the plant to suggest wild but contained. These details matter, but there's always risk. One overzealous guest with breathy admiration can ruin everything. You've heard horror stories of someone leaning in too close, fogging the glass with their sighs, introducing humidity fluctuations. There are gasps, there are apologies. But the damage is done. Ferns don't forgive easily. By now, the polite classes are in full frondal hysteria. You walk down the street and see ferns peeking out of every window. You hear whispers in the hat shop about someone's blechnum throwing spores prematurely. The butcher's wife is rumored to be using soot-filtered rainwater, an audacious method if true. And in the middle of it all, you exist in a swirling chlorophyll-rich drama of etiquette, beauty, and gentle vengeance. Your parlor may be small, but your fern kingdom, it is mighty. You lace up your boots well, have your boots laced more accurately, and set out into the countryside with a notebook, a tin of ginger biscuits, and a magnifying glass dangling from a ribbon around your neck. You are not alone. Dozens of respectable gentlemen and more than a few adventurous women in scandalously muddy skirts are combing the hedgerows and ravines in pursuit of botanical glory. Welcome to the world of the gentleman fern hunters. This isn't your casual garden hobby anymore. This is a full-blown national pastime with the excitement of a fox hunt and the social cachet of a university lecture. You're wading through bracken and underbrush, slipping on moss-slicked stones, absolutely convinced that the next ravine might hold the elusive Trichomanes speciosum, or some other fronded treasure that will elevate you from respected amateur to whispered-about legend. These fern-hunting excursions are more than rustic weekend getaways, they're status quests. Many of the most enthusiastic hunters are clergymen and country squires, eager to prove their refinement and naturalist credentials. Some are surgeons, lawyers, or retired military officers, all tramping around in frock coats, brandishing spades like they're sabers. And there are clubs, oh so many clubs, complete with medals, newsletters, and debates over whether one can ethically remove a fern from churchyard walls. Historians still argue whether this sudden surge in amateur botany was a true scientific awakening, or just a socially sanctioned excuse for men to muck about in nature while avoiding their in-laws. Still, you admire their enthusiasm. There's something infectious about a man in polished boots, squealing over a new clump of Asplenium ruta muraria, especially when he immediately slips and lands in it. But fern hunting isn't all laughter and Latin. It's dangerous in that particularly Victorian way, where peril is wrapped in politeness and a monocle. You cross rope bridges over roaring rivers. You lower yourself into damp, echoing glens by way of frayed hemp rope tied to a cart. There are accounts, suspiciously romantic ones, of gentlemen slipping breaking limbs or contracting fevers from bog exposure. One overzealous collector in Wales reportedly had to be hauled out of a cave by a passing goat herder after crawling in to rescue a particularly photogenic specimen. There are tragedies, too. In 1861, a young woman named Miss Sarah Whittington fell to her death from a Cornish cliff while reaching for a rare cliff-dwelling fern. The newspapers were breathless. Death in the cause of science. And while her demise was mourned, some quietly noted that her Hymenophyllum wilsoni specimen was intact and eventually added to a gentleman's private collection. Classy. You pause your hike to sketch a delicate frond curling under a fallen log. Your fingers are cold, your skirts are wet, and there's mud on your hem, but your heart is light. Out here, social niceties blur. A duchess and a blacksmith's daughter can both lose their minds over a patch of Dryopteris. For a brief moment, everyone is equal in the eyes of Moss. But of course, that doesn't last. Back in town, the class divisions reassert themselves with a vengeance. Your carefully collected specimens must be presented just so pressed, labeled, mounted on cream cardstock, and logged in a tidy register with dates, coordinates, and weather conditions. Some collectors go further, adding small watercolors of the original setting. One eccentric baronet is said to have built miniature sets to reenact his fern-finding triumphs, complete with tiny wax figurines of himself and his valet. And then, there's the colonial angle. Because not all fern hunters are content with the British Isles. As the British Empire sprawls ever outward, so does the fern craze. Soldiers, traders, missionaries, and explorers begin shipping ferns back from India, Australia, South Africa, the Caribbean. Anywhere the empire reaches, so too do glass cases filled with roots and spores. You visit one gentleman's home where a freshly imported Dicksonia antarctica stands like a leafy monument in the entry hall, dripping condensation and demanding admiration. He brags about having risked malaria and cannibals for it, though more likely he bribed a port clerk. In truth, many of these foreign ferns don't thrive in British homes. The climates are too different, the conditions too unstable. But that doesn't stop anyone. Failing to grow an exotic fern is less shameful than never having tried to grow one at all. Much like wearing an uncomfortable hat, the suffering proves your status. And yet there's something undeniably poetic about this pursuit. These aren't just plants, they're fragments of distant lands carefully packaged and imported, then nurtured into life under glass. Your living room becomes a microcosm of empire, a leafy patchwork of global ambition and damp optimism. Of course, not everyone supports the madness. Satirical magazines start poking fun at fern fondlers and spore sniffers. Caricatures of disheveled botanists waving fronds like flags appear in Punch alongside mock dialogues such as, "Good heavens, man, what is that in your case? A very fine Pteris cretica, sir. Well, take it back to Crete and leave us in peace." But ridicule only fuels the obsession. You've gone from passive admiration to full-on commitment. Your friends tease you. Your maid mutters about green stains on the curtains. Your sister claims your parlor smells like a compost heap. You beam. Because this isn't just a hobby anymore. It's a lifestyle, a mission, a polite crusade with field notes. You fall asleep at night dreaming of cliffs lined with fern-filled crevices of misty woods glowing with dappled light. You wake up and immediately check your Wardian case. A new shoot has appeared overnight, and your entire day is better for it. Somewhere out there, another fern hunter is slipping on a wet rock, clutching a spade and praying they don't die before cataloging their Polypodium vulgare. You wish them well. And you've already scheduled your next excursion. The hills are calling. You ease into a velvet-cushioned armchair, teacup in hand, perfectly poised as if nothing in the world could possibly bother you. But across the room, just to your left, a rival socialite is hosting her own little plant spectacle, and it's making your eyebrow twitch. You sit politely, but your thoughts are sharp as pruning shears. Because in the world of polite society, ferns are no longer confined to botanical journals and misty forests. They've migrated indoors, and not just physically. They've infiltrated the very language of status. Drawing rooms have become battlegrounds, and plant arrangements are weapons in silk gloves. The hostess of this particular gathering is Lady Merriweather, a woman with too many vowels in her name and a suspiciously lush Asplenium nidus perched by her piano. As guests trickle in, they make the appropriate admiring sounds, gentle ah-s, and how charming s, but you know exactly what they're all thinking. That fern isn't really thriving. It's just had a clever dusting and some aggressive leaf oiling. It's fern warfare, dear listener. And it's fought with lace fans, loaded compliments, and gentle cruelty. You drift through the room carefully, not noticing how Lady Merriweather's fern display is dangerously close to the fireplace. That heat will crisp her delicate fronds in under a fortnight. A delicious piece of foreshadowing, really. You tuck that away for later and pause at the tea table where two other guests are locked in a tight-lipped debate over propagation methods. "Of course I use only dew-collected rainwater," one says, pinky extended. "Oh, how quaint," the other responds. "I suppose some people don't mind a bit of sulfur." You pretend to be interested in the scones, but your ears are tuned. This is high-stakes gossip disguised as horticultural advice. What makes it so juicy is the plausible deniability. You're not actually insulting someone, you're merely expressing concern for their fern's long-term well-being. Oh, Lady Atherton lets hers dry out between waterings. How daring. I suppose she enjoys the look of curled edges. Ouch. Historians still argue whether these social rivalries around plants were spontaneous expressions of competitiveness or a convenient outlet for Victorian women to express ambition, in a world that offered them very few arenas for it. And oh, do the ladies perform. Every fern visit becomes a tableau vivant, a slight bend of the wrist, a thoughtful furrow of the brow, a soft breath over the glass. Every action says, "Look how tender I am. Look how much I understand this fragile thing." But tenderness has limits. At a particularly infamous gathering in 1859, two women reportedly sabotaged each other's plant displays the night before a botanical charity auction. One used soot to smudge the glass on her rival's Wardian case. The other loosened the moss around a prized root ball. No one was ever formally accused, but both ferns looked suspiciously unwell by morning, and both women were mysteriously too ill to attend future luncheons for several months. And the social politics aren't limited to plants themselves. You need to know the right names, pronounce them without stumbling, and hint that you've read the latest volume of the Fern Gazette, even if it mostly put you to sleep. Using outdated names like Pteris cerulata instead of Nephrolepis exaltata, that's practically treason. It's not uncommon to see someone dramatically correct a fellow guest. Oh, how charming, though. I believe the current classification has shifted. One must stay current, mustn't one? Delivered with a little laugh, of course. Always the laugh. Even seating arrangements begin to follow plant-based hierarchies. The lady with the rarest fern might earn the seat closest to the hostess. The one whose fronds looked a bit brown last month may find herself positioned awkwardly near the pianoforte, just far enough to make reaching the cakes a bit of a chore. And don't think for a moment the men are absent from this theater. Some of the most ruthless critiques come from armchair botanists in tailored waistcoats, stroking their mutton chops and muttering about poor root memory and inferior upland specimens. They'll gently annihilate an entire greenhouse's reputation with a single dismissive nod. But perhaps the most deliciously vicious aspect of all this is the etiquette around visiting the fern. A visitor is expected, no obligated, to make a gracious pilgrimage to view their hostess's display. Compliments must be delivered with precise tone and timing. Too gushing, you're seen as desperate. Too vague, clearly jealous. The correct approach is to exhale softly and murmur something like, "What a soothing arrangement." Quite meditative. So balanced. A single raised eyebrow can say the rest. Of course some rebel against this nonsense. You know of one widow who replaced her entire fern collection with a single rubber plant and dared anyone to question it. They did. Constantly. She loved it. In a particularly daring twist, a group of young women in Edinburgh began circulating letters rating ferns seen in friends' houses, secret scorecards tucked into their gloves. One entry read, "Mrs. D. Boston Fern 710. Good curl, mild mildew scent, poor framing." These critiques weren't shared publicly, but the fear of receiving a low score hung over every Sunday tea like a cloud of overly steeped chamomile. And through it all you maneuver. Your fern is a stunner, carefully lit and slightly elevated to catch just enough gaze while pretending not to invite it. You've replaced the moss base with crushed white marble for contrast, and introduced a carved driftwood accent that looks both artful and natural. People admire it. People envy it. And you smile and you stir your tea and you say nothing when Lady Meriwether's fern, your spiritual nemesis, suddenly begins to wilt under the warmth of her own carelessness. You don't need to say a word, because sometimes the best revenge is just watching a frond collapse. You're flipping through a thick, cloth-bound volume with edges tinted green and pages heavy with ink and ego. Every illustration is more extravagant than the last, delicate fern fronds shaded like they were painted by angels with insomnia, each Latin name unfurling across the page like a vine with academic credentials. This is fern mania in print form, and you, like everyone else in Victorian society, are absolutely lapping it up. Because owning the fern is one thing. Understanding it? Well, that makes you superior. Publishing becomes the next frontier in this leafy frenzy. Printers and booksellers can barely keep up with the demand. The moment you manage to acquire one of the newly released fern guides, someone is at your elbow asking to just glance at your copy. And by glance, of course, they mean evaluate, compare, and possibly judge your bookmark placement. This is the golden age of botanical printing. You've got lithographs, woodcuts, chromolithographs, and the occasional hand-colored plate, each more obsessive than the last. Some of the illustrations are so detailed, you swear you can see the spores individually sighing. Your personal favorite is Thomas More's The Ferns of Great Britain and Ireland. It comes with actual pressed samples in deluxe editions, real ferns flattened like social anxiety under footmen's shoes. You keep yours wrapped in linen, hidden away from sunlight and nosy cousins. But you're not alone in your print obsession. Gentlemen botanists issue monographs with increasingly absurd titles like Fronds and Friends, A Memoir of Moisture, or On the Sympathetic Responses of Ferns to Barometric Pressure. Ladies' journals include entire sections devoted to indoor plant trends and articles with provocative titles like To Mist or Not to Mist, or The Secret Language of Shade. The content ranges from genuinely educational to gently unhinged. You read one article arguing that ferns, due to their symmetrical structure, are a model for perfect moral behavior. Another insists that proper fern care can cure melancholia. And one very enthusiastic pamphlet claims that ferns, if placed in the bedroom, can calm hysterical tendencies in women and excitable urges in men. Useful for the whole household. Historians still argue whether this explosion of printed material was a true democratization of knowledge, or simply a cash grab on the part of printers eager to monetize polite hysteria. Still, it's not just the books that circulate. There are fern-specific calling cards embossed with tiny green fronds. There are invitation cards with delicate borders of asplenium illustrations. There's even fern-patterned stationery rumored to carry a secret message: I am tasteful, restrained, and also better than you. Naturally, with the rise of literature comes the rise of arguments. You're attending a salon one evening supposedly to listen to a reading of Tennyson, when the conversation turns, as it so often does, to nomenclature. Latin names are tossed around like sugar lumps. Someone dares to mispronounce Polypodium vulgare and the room goes frosty. An older gentleman mutters amateur into his brandy. You nod as if you agree, even though you've been secretly calling it polypony in your head for weeks. And the taxonomy debates. No one agrees on anything. Is that a Dryopterus filix mass, or is it a subspecies of Ethereum? Someone in Glasgow insists it's an entirely new genus. A woman in York declares that naming a fern after a man is proof of patriarchy. A vicar from Kent sends angry letters to the Gardener's Chronicle weekly, each one footnoted, each one ignored. Even spelling becomes a battlefield. Is it foliagey or foliaged? One bold soul invents the word fraudulence, which is both ridiculous and completely adopted by the following Thursday. You begin keeping your own fern journal. It's full of pressed clippings, poetic fragments, and notes like, spotted young Asplenium adiantum nigrum in Mrs. P's hallway, evidently thrives near ceramic umbrella stand. Consider adding violet glass behind Wardian case for moody depth. Do not under any circumstances trust Mr. Eversley's advice on misting. But the print frenzy doesn't stop at non-fiction. Ferns make their way into poetry, children's stories, and the occasional melodramatic novel. You read a serialized romance in the Illustrated London News, where the heroine hides secret letters under a potted fern only to be betrayed when the fronds begin to wilt, an early example of plant-based foreshadowing. Even household decor follows suit. You're gifted a ceramic plate with a green fern curling across the rim. Curtains start coming printed with fern silhouettes. Fern wallpaper, fern-shaped candlesticks. Your aunt buys an entire tea set painted with Blechnum gibbum, which she insists is very continental. You begin to suspect the walls are watching you. But this obsession with appearance isn't just for show, it seeps into the very psychology of the time. People begin interpreting personality traits based on preferred ferns. A lover of maidenhairs is seen as delicate and romantic. A fan of heart's tongue, fern bold, possibly ungovernable. Those who collect scaly ferns are suspected of harboring revolutionary tendencies. You meet one gentleman who insists his emotional state is tied to his fern's well-being. We wither together, he tells you over a plate of seed cake. You nod solemnly, not quite sure if he's joking. You never see him again, but you later hear his fern survived him by 3 years. All these books, these papers, these parlor games, they're more than cultural clutter. They're a shared language, a coded way to communicate passion and hierarchy without ever raising your voice. And you're fluent now. You quote Latin. You spot a spurious spore illustration from across a crowded salon. You once corrected a typo in a fernfield guide, and the author sent you a thank you letter and a pressed frond. You keep it folded inside your diary like a pressed bit of triumph. The fronds aren't just in your case anymore. They're in your head. Twisting, spreading, blooming into knowledge, into obsession, into that quiet, papery pride only a true fern aficionado can understand. You're standing in the corner of a conservatory, pretending to admire a hanging basket of Boston ferns when you overhear it. 2 words spoken in a hushed, scandalized tone, stolen spores. You freeze teacup midair. You've stumbled into one of the best-kept secrets of Victorian fern culture. Beneath the soft fronds and pressed flower notes lies a tangled mess of scandal, jealousy, and the kind of gossip that could wilt even the hardiest Dryopterus. This is no longer just a plant hobby. It's a social minefield. And if you aren't careful, someone's going to accuse you of tampering with their frond edges. First, let's talk theft. Fern theft was real. Entire cases were reportedly burgled. People would sneak into each other's greenhouses and pinch rare cuttings or spore samples. One particularly brazen thief in Devon posed as a chimney sweep to gain access to a manor garden made off with 3 clippings and wasn't caught for 6 months. By then, his fern collection had earned a commendation at the local horticultural show. There are documented cases of fern smugglers hiding specimens in parasols, hat boxes, and even inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. A lady in Liverpool once found a mystery fern sprouting from a gift bouquet, an underhanded flex according to her rival, who claimed the plant had been cultivated using immoral root hormones, which weren't a real thing. But let's not get bogged down in facts when the drama's this good. It wasn't just theft, it was sabotage too. A suspiciously overwatered fern might be a case of spite. A fungal infection that only appears after you refuse to lend someone your prized asplenium, perhaps not so accidental. There were rumors never confirmed, of course, that plant gossips would visit rivals under the guise of admiration, breathe a little too closely on the case glass, and leave behind subtle spores from inferior ferns. Historians still argue whether these cases were exaggerated by competitive imaginations, or represented a darker passive-aggressive undercurrent in the Victorian obsession with order, appearances, and social assent. But gossip wasn't just for the bad actors, it was the social glue. You sit in a conservatory sipping tea from a porcelain cup, painted with what else fern fronds, and listen as the conversation turns not to politics, but propagation. Each shared anecdote carries a secret payload of judgment. Have you heard Mr. Henley's entire collection succumb to scale mites? So tragic. Of course, some say it was the coal dust. He does keep the cases near the servants' entrance. Oh dear, poor man. I did hear he was experimenting with seaweed mulch. Bold choice. Rather avant-garde, and completely wrong. Even the language of botany becomes a kind of coded whisper network. Calling someone's collection wild implies lack of control. Describing a specimen as lively hints at overgrowth. The worst insult, unbalanced. As in, her fern displays a touch unbalanced. A social death sentence usually delivered with a gentle sigh and a slow shake of the head. Of course, none of this is official. It's all behind-the-hand commentary, fan flutters, and lingering glances over the rim of a teacup. But the consequences are tangible. You once watched an entire week of social invitations dry up for a woman who mistook a Dryopteris affinis for a Polystichum aculeatum, a taxonomic blunder she never lived down, despite 3 public apologies and a donation to the Fern Society. And let's not forget courtship. Victorian plant culture is tangled with flirtation, and ferns offer the perfect excuse for closeness without scandal. A young man may not be permitted to whisper sweet nothings into your ear, but he can comment on the shimmer of your frond tips. You're invited to view his rare Cibodium glaucum in the greenhouse, and before you know it, there are rumors of engagement. Some parents encouraged it. Better a daughter who collects pressed fronds than one who writes poetry or speaks her mind. Others feared the proximity of moist-shaded conservatories and hormone-addled young people. One vicar banned his niece from attending fern club meetings after an unfortunate misunderstanding involving spore packets and a misdelivered letter. But it wasn't all romance. Some plant-based friendships spiraled into petty feuds, faster than you can say uneven light exposure. You recall a brief but fiery quarrel between 2 amateur botanists in Kent over whether ferns preferred wood ash or fish emulsion. It ended with one of them relocating her entire collection 2 towns over. Ferns were repotted, lines were drawn. Then there were the secret societies. Yes, actual societies with names like the Gentle Frond League and the Ladies' Propagation Circle. Semi-private gatherings where members exchanged rare specimens, shared rumored care techniques, and maintained a thin veil of civility while quietly plotting social victories. One such group operated a traveling fern, which members passed around to care for in 1-week rotations. They kept a communal diary chronicling its well-being. Naturally, it all fell apart in week 8, when the fern's fronds drooped mysteriously. Accusations flew, trust crumbled. A friendship ended over alleged over-misting. And still, through all the drama, you stay steady. You've learned to navigate the currents. You always compliment with a question. What a lovely spore cluster do you find they brown when over-fertilized? You never bring your best fern to a first invitation, and you know better than to trust a woman who insists she never has trouble with mealybugs. Perhaps the most ironic thing. The ferns themselves remain utterly indifferent. They grow or they don't. They thrive in silence. They couldn't care less about whose tea you're drinking, or which lady pinched your frond arrangement in a moment of jealousy. They just keep unfurling. But you of course care very much, because in a society where women are told to speak softly, smile politely, and decorate their homes, the fern becomes more than decoration. It becomes a proxy for personal pride, social power, and maybe, just maybe, a place where rebellion grows in the shade. So when someone leans a little too close to your case and casually asks, "Isn't that frond a bit crisp?" you smile sweetly, take a sip of your tea and reply, "Oh, I hadn't noticed." But then some people do mistake healthy texture for dryness. Touché. You're kneeling in the conservatory, head practically inside the Wardian case when you catch at a faint rustle. Not the genteel whisper of a fern frond unfurling, no. This is heavier, wetter, more deliberate. You freeze. A chill dances up your spine. Slowly, you turn. It's the moss. All right, not just the moss. But if fern fever had a shadow twin, it would be the creeping presence of all the other plants that started muscling in once ferns laid the groundwork. Because in the wake of Victorian fern mania came a wave of leafy opportunists and the people who couldn't help but love them. This, dear listener, is where the obsession grows roots. Ferns cracked the glass. Now the whole garden's pressing its face against it, asking to be let in. You see, once Wardian cases became common, people realized they could house more than just ferns. Suddenly, entire microclimates blossomed behind curved panes. Mosses, liverworts, carnivorous plants, even sensitive mimosa, all of them staked their claim in the humid little kingdoms of middle-class parlors. And with new plants came new enthusiasts. Some polite, some not so polite. That's when you begin noticing a shift in tone. The fern crowd, once considered the pinnacle of plant sophistication, starts to mutter about plant dilution. Suddenly, your gatherings aren't just fern-forward. You're hosting debates about whether Selaginella is too mossy for company, or if it's just the next bold frontier in tasteful neglect. Historians still argue whether this diversification of plant interest marked the natural evolution of a horticultural movement, or the beginning of fern culture's slow social decay. You host a modest luncheon one Tuesday and make the grave mistake of letting your cousin, a known orchid sympathizer, bring her phalaenopsis. It's a gorgeous, sensuous thing with glossy leaves and blooms like whispers. The room shifts, eyes narrow. Someone knocks over a spoon. You recover. You praise the fern centerpiece. You pretend not to notice that two ladies have suddenly remembered they need to tend to their cases at home. You suspect one of them has just ordered an orchid on credit out of spite. The orchid craze, of course, will become its own tempest. But in these early stages, it's an insurgent force slipping in through fern-fortified defenses and catching people off guard. Unlike ferns, which are modest, secretive, a bit shy, orchids are bold, flashy, full of the kind of swagger that gets novels banned in Edinburgh. And yet you find yourself drawn to them. Still, loyalty is loyalty. You keep your primary focus on your ferns, but begin adding small, discrete elements to your display. A tuft of moss, a trailing ivy. You call it atmosphere. A few guests call it clutter. But when your adiantum responds with a healthier sheen, you know you're onto something. That's when the idea hits you. You start designing layered plant environments, miniature ecosystems inside your cases. Ferns remain central, but now they're supported by soft moss beds, arching vines, even tiny lithops peeking from rocky corners. You call it naturalistic display. Your rivals call it messy. But the compliments keep coming. And then come the visitors. Oh, they whisper, peering into your latest creation. It's like a forest in miniature. It is. It's exactly that. And you, dear listener, are its sovereign. Of course, once you break the single-species rule, chaos creeps in. You begin to hear the dreaded phrase, indoor jungle. It's meant as an insult, but secretly it thrills you. You're pushing against the edges of your Wardian case now, figuratively, then literally. You expand to freestanding glasshouses. You rearrange furniture to make room for taller fronds. You start researching tropical humidity techniques. You catch yourself referring to your bedroom as the southern enclosure. The line between garden and house begins to blur. Meanwhile, the print culture adapts. Periodicals now feature tips for integrating ferns with accompanying flora. Articles with titles like "The Graceful Cascade Blending Ivy with Fernery" begin circulating. A few anarchists even publish screeds declaring the Wardian case a relic of confinement and promote open-plan window gardens instead. You roll your eyes, but secretly you try it. A small case by the window. No lid, just fern moss and breeze. And yes, it thrives. But this expansion brings with it a new kind of anxiety. More plants mean more variables. Your misting schedule becomes a symphony of moving parts. The ivy needs trimming, the mimosa sulks without enough light, the fern. Well, the fern soldiers on, but you sense it's annoyed at sharing space. You're no longer just a fern connoisseur. You're a microclimate manager, a one-person botanical bureaucracy. Your journal entries shift. Less poetry, more charts. Water levels, light angles, condensation rates by hour. Still, it's exhilarating. And you're not alone. Whole circles spring up devoted to mixed-case cultivation. Some see it as evolution. Others call it betrayal. The Fern Society issues a gently scolding statement reminding readers to prioritize purity in arrangement. You frame the letter. Of course, with every movement comes its purists. You attend one particularly tense meeting where an elderly man in a starched cravat hisses that moss is the weed of glass. The room goes silent. Someone faints. Someone else accidentally drops a spore tin. You side with the moss. Because here's the truth, this whole thing was never just about ferns. It was about wonder. About curating life, creating order from chaos, carving out a pocket of verdant beauty in a soot-stained world. If that beauty now includes a sprig of creeping fig and the occasional carnivorous sundew, so be it. And deep down, you suspect the fern approves. It's not one for drama. It just grows quiet, patient, unbothered by your human entanglements. At the end of the evening, you sit in front of your largest case, soft candlelight flickering against the glass. Inside, your plants sleep in stillness. Fern, moss, vine, all nestled together like secrets kept in green. You take a long breath. The air smells of damp earth and slow contentment. Outside, the night presses in. But here the jungle lives. You're elbow deep in peat moss again, humming a tune from last week's musicale when you glance at your fingers and realize they're stained permanently green. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. You scrub, but the chlorophyll's won. You've crossed over. You are now what society gently refers to as one of those fern people. It starts subtly. You used to only visit the conservatory once a day, maybe twice if there was condensation to check. Now you have a strict dawn, noon, dusk routine. You've taken to naming individual fronds. You've had dreams about frond symmetry. One of them scolded you for inconsistent light exposure. Your friends begin to notice. They ask if you've taken up new hobbies. You say not really, while gently massaging a young Polystichum setiferum like a prize poodle. The shift isn't just behavioral, it's spatial. Your home has become a living tribute to your obsession. There are more plants than people. Ferns frame every window. One shelf collapsed under the weight of a particularly enthusiastic Dicksonia antarctica. You did not grieve the shelf. You grieved the fern's bruised stipe. You find yourself rearranging your parlor furniture not for guests, but for airflow. Your fireplace sits dormant all winter, not for fuel economy, but because your ferns prefer cool corners. Your maid mutters about mildew. You nod thoughtfully and buy her a fern apron hand-embroidered. You're not alone, of course. Victorian fern obsession has a tipping point, and society is wobbling on the brink. The newspapers begin to mock you with biting satire. The Fernatic One column calls it. They draw caricatures of people dressed in head-to-toe moss muttering about spore production while ignoring dinner invitations. A Punch cartoon features a man proposing to a Wardian case. You laugh a bit too loudly and then immediately check your own case's humidity tray. But the mockery can't compete with the joy. There's something profoundly soothing about fern maintenance. The trimming, the misting, the subtle changes in color that tell you things you'd never notice otherwise. The way each new frond curls out like a slow-motion fireworks display, green, precise, unapologetically alive. One woman you know, a widow with a reputation for dramatic taste, has turned her entire sitting room into a walk-through fern grotto. She claims it helps with her nerves. Her doctor disagrees, but he hasn't been invited back since he described her Blechnum spicant as unruly. You know of another fellow, an apothecary, who's begun blending fern imagery into his shop signage. He now offers a line of frond-friendly tonics which don't do much but look smashing on a windowsill. And it's not just drawing rooms anymore. Ferns are on handkerchiefs. Ferns are stitched into waistcoat linings. A man in Bath opens a gentleman's smoking club with fronds pressed into the wallpaper and a strict no cigars near foliage rule. He's wildly successful, at least among those who enjoy the smell of moist bark and boiled wool. You attend a charity ball where the theme is a woodland evening. The host has filled the ballroom with potted ferns, mossy archways, and an actual tree. The musicians wear leaf-shaped boutonnieres. Someone slips on a spilled terrarium. No one minds. And of course the rituals intensify. You've begun using moonlight to time your watering schedule. You gently rotate your pots each solstice just in case they enjoy cosmic balance. You read poetry aloud to your Ethereum Niponicum, which has recently begun to lean toward the sound of your voice. Or maybe it's the window. Either way, you feel bonded. Historians still argue whether this stage of Victorian fern culture, this full, unashamed immersion, was a form of emotional expression, spiritual compensation, or just what happens when a society represses absolutely everything else for long enough. But you don't have time for debate. You have a new spore culture incubating. There's something oddly empowering about knowing exactly what a plant needs, giving it that, and watching it flourish. The certainty is comforting. Life is unpredictable. Politics are fraught. But you can control a microclimate in your hallway. And sometimes that's enough. Your guests grow fewer but more devoted. They bring rare soil samples. They arrive late because they stopped to collect moss from a church wall. They know how to spell Asplenium bulbiferum without blinking. These are your people now. You bond over pH levels and clay pot debates. You've witnessed a woman cry because someone over-trimmed a crozier. You offered her a cup of tea and a composted sympathy note. And there's something else. A softness in your day that wasn't there before. You've learned patience, not the performative kind, but the deep, quiet sort that settles in your bones. Ferns don't demand. They wait. They're humble, ancient things that have survived ice ages and empire collapses. They don't rush to bloom. They don't beg for attention. You begin to suspect they know more than you do. At night, your house hums with green life. The air smells of bark and quiet growth. Even your cat has stopped knocking over pots, perhaps recognizing finally the sanctity of the fronds. You lie in bed listening to the gentle creak of the conservatory glass settling into place and think, yes, this is good. You may be slightly unwell, slightly obsessed, slightly mold adjacent, but you're not alone, and you are without question at peace. You're standing in front of a mirror hat pinned just so gloves crisp, and a fresh leaf from your favorite asplenium tucked discreetly into your lapel, more personal signature than fashion statement. You're not going to a garden party. No, tonight is more serious. Tonight you're attending a Fern Society meeting and everyone there has opinions. Because by now the obsession has matured. It's no longer scattered whispers over tea or cautious glances into each other's conservatories. The Fern movement has organized. It has committees, hierarchies, bylaws, and a disturbingly intense newsletter. Yes, it's time to meet the Fern institutions. It begins with the formation of polite societies, initially friendly gatherings of like-minded enthusiasts, who wanted to compare notes on Cystopteris fragilis without the pressure of parlor gossip. But like any Victorian structure, what started as gentle collegiality evolved quickly into something far more structured and competitive. The most famous, of course, is the British Teratological Society, founded in the 1890s, but preceded by decades of informal fern clubs, regional networks, and at least one all-female circle known as the Sisterhood of the Spore. They met every other Tuesday and were known to exchange coded messages in fern-based embroidery. One sampler included the words, "Vigor in shadow," stitched below a particularly healthy Dryopteris. Interpret that however you like. You walk into the society's meeting room, polished wood floors, velvet drapes, the faint smell of boiled root polish, and you're greeted with nods, stiff smiles, and at least one sideways glance at your lapel frond. It's not an easy crowd. These are veterans. Their Wardian cases are spotless. Their Latin pronunciation could give a classics professor pause. And if you suggest misting more than once daily, prepare for a polite but thorough dismantling of your entire horticultural philosophy. There are lectures, of course. PowerPoint hasn't been invented yet, so it's all wax charts and blackboard sketches. One man speaks for 45 minutes about the geometric logic of fern spiral emergence. Someone claps. Someone else coughs just loudly enough to register doubt. And always the debates. Is Ethereum Filix femina truly distinct from its alpine cousin? Should ferns be considered decorative or structural in public gardens? Is it socially acceptable to hybridize? These are not trivial questions. These are foundational discussions, the stuff Victorian egos are built on. Historians still argue whether these societies advanced botanical science or simply created echo chambers for the Victorian middle class to flex knowledge without consequence. But don't be fooled. These societies also offer community, especially for women. In an era where public speaking, scientific authorship, and even basic education are often off limits, Fern culture opens doors. Women write fern guides under initials or pen names. They publish anonymous columns in gardening journals. Some even run nurseries under their brothers' names. You know of one formidable widow in Surrey who lectured under the moniker Professor Thistle, complete with mustache, disguise, and a traveling trunk of root specimens. There's solidarity in spores. Your own place in the hierarchy isn't fixed yet. You've made your contributions, lent a rare trichomanes cutting for the spring display, hosted a summer fern walk complete with annotated pamphlets. But you still haven't broken into the society's inner circle, the panel of classification. Oh yes, they sound important because they are. 5 members rotating annually, tasked with deciding how ferns are grouped, named, and celebrated within the society. There are whispered allegations of bias. One gentleman is rumored to have reclassified his cousin's fern out of spite. Another allegedly denied a perfectly legitimate Blecknum entry because he found its pot visually destabilizing. Naturally, you're curious. You begin to observe, to track who dines with whom after meetings, who receives advance copies of new specimen notes, who's suddenly traveling abroad whenever a vote looms. You keep your own logbook, not of fronds but of faces, a different sort of leaf perhaps. Eventually you're nominated to host. It's a small honor but significant. You spend days preparing. Your specimens are positioned just so. The tea is steeped to perfection. There's just the right amount of oat biscuits. You even bribe your nephew to stand at the door and hand out pressed fern bookmarks with every guest's name embossed. It goes well, too well. Your rival Lady Fenwick makes a point of complimenting your Arachniotes Standishi 3 times. You detect sarcasm by round 2 but smile anyway. You're learning. And it works. At the next meeting, you're asked to sit in on a classification review. You bring your best gloves and your sharpest pencil. No one questions it. You're in. The meeting is everything you dreamed: long, pedantic, vaguely hostile. You love it. Arguments over spore print color intensity nearly derail the evening. Someone produces a specimen under glass that causes 2 members to faint and 1 to weep. You take notes on everything. Later, you sit with one of the senior members, a woman with more ferns than friends and a sneaky fondness for sweet sherry. She leans in and tells you, it's not about the plants, not really. It's about knowing something down to its roots. You nod because you do know. It's about order. It's about control. It's about belonging. In a world where so much is dictated for you, your dress, your speech, your future, you've carved out a space where you are the authority. Here among the spores, you're not just allowed to be obsessive. You're celebrated for it. And later that night, as you walk home beneath a cloudy moon and the smell of moss clinging to your coat, you think maybe, just maybe, one day you'll sit on the panel. You'd like that. Very much. You're back in your study, the familiar scent of damp earth and old paper wrapping around you like a comforting shawl. Outside, the city's gas lamps flicker uncertainly in the mist, but inside you're surrounded by your carefully curated collection. Your ferns, your journals, your pressed leaves. You reach for your quill, dipping it into ink that smells faintly of pine resin, ready to capture what you've learned. By now, the fern obsession has seeped beyond society's drawing rooms and conservatories, touching the very fabric of Victorian life. Its influence extends into art, architecture, and even fashion. Patterned wallpapers swirl with delicate fronds. Ladies' gowns sport embroidered leaves, and jewelers craft brooches shaped like curled fiddleheads. It's everywhere, whether you want it or not. And yet the fern's symbolism is complicated. It represents modesty and sincerity, but also secret knowledge and endurance. It's a plant that thrives in the shadows, quietly persistent. Perhaps that's why Victorians were so drawn to it, because it embodied their own contradictions. You recall a curious conversation with a local poet who told you that ferns were the confidants of the soul. They didn't shout like roses or trumpet like daffodils. Instead, they whispered their beauty quietly, inviting contemplation. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some critics dismissed the fern craze as trivial, a fad that would pass like so many others. Newspapers mocked the fernatic obsession with withering caricatures, and satire ran rampant. But you knew better. You'd watched the fern craze transform people. You'd witnessed friendships formed, rivalries ignited, and passions ignited in the shadows of Wardian cases. You'd learned that ferns were more than plants. They were a language, a social currency, a secret world. Historians still argue whether this fascination was an escape from a rapidly industrializing, often harsh society, or a subtle form of rebellion against rigid social norms. Your own view is more personal. The fern is a quiet rebellion against noise, against haste, against the relentless march of time. It's an anchor in a world spinning ever faster. As you write, you notice the gentle unfurling of a new frond in your favorite case. It's small, perfect, and slow. You smile. This obsession, you realize, has become a part of you. It's shaped your days and your nights, your friendships and your rivalries, your joys and your anxieties. But it has also given you something precious, a sense of control, a connection to nature's patient rhythms, and a community, even if that community is occasionally prickly. You close your journal and look around your study, the fern-patterned wallpaper glowing softly in the lamplight. Outside, the city sleeps, but here, in this quiet green sanctuary, life continues. And for now, that's enough. You step out into the damp twilight of a London evening, the fog curling like a living thing between gas lamps and cobblestones. The air smells faintly of coal smoke, damp brick, and if you're lucky, the faint sweet musk of a nearby fern conservatory. The city, with all its clatter and bustle, feels oddly subdued tonight, like it's holding its breath, waiting. By this stage in the fern craze, you've come to realize it's not just about plants anymore. It's about identity, about carving out a space in a society that often seems unyielding and unkind. Fiddleheads are your badges, pressed fronds your secret letters. You've joined a growing chorus of people who found in these delicate greens a kind of refuge. The fern, after all, thrives in the quiet corners, shady glens, mossy banks, places forgotten by the rush of the world. And so do you. You attend a lecture one evening held in a grand hall that smells of polished wood and damp stone. The speaker, a sprightly woman with a sharp eye and a sharper wit, discusses the fern's surprising place in Victorian culture, not just as a botanical curiosity, but as a symbol in art and literature. She mentions the fern's appearances in pre-Raphaelite paintings, its whispered allusions in poetry, and its role as a quiet emblem of endurance and hidden knowledge. You listen captivated as she traces how the fern became a kind of spiritual metaphor, a signpost pointing to something just out of reach. Perhaps hope, perhaps melancholy, perhaps a gentle rebellion against the rigidity of the age. Outside the lecture hall, you overhear a debate. Some argue the fern obsession is a passing fancy, a Victorian eccentricity that will soon be forgotten. Others defend it fiercely, claiming it has reshaped the way society thinks about nature, beauty, and even science. Historians still argue whether the fern craze was a profound cultural movement or simply a horticultural fad dressed up in Victorian propriety. You find yourself agreeing with both views depending on the day. Later, you stroll through a quiet garden where ferns brush softly against your coat. The night air is cool and damp, and you can almost hear the rustle of ancient forests in the silence. You think about how the fern obsession was more than just a hobby. It was a mirror reflecting the hopes, anxieties, and desires of an entire era. It was a way to grasp at something enduring amid rapid change, and as you turn your collar against the mist, you realize that for all its quirks and oddities, the fern craze gave people a way to slow down, to notice, and to find beauty in the shadows. It gave you a way to see the world a little differently. And sometimes that's all anyone really needs. You're settling into your favorite chair, the one by the window that catches the soft afternoon light just so. Outside, a gentle rain begins to patter against the glass, a steady, soothing rhythm that matches the quiet pulse of your fern collection. You breathe in the familiar scent of damp earth and leaf mold, letting the peace wash over you. The fern obsession, with all its twists and turns, its whispered rivalries and secret societies, has brought you here to a place of quiet reflection. You remember the early days, the thrill of discovery, the nervous pride in your first pressed frond, the delicate thrill of learning the Latin names without a single stumble. You think of the vast network of fellow enthusiasts, the careful cultivation of microclimates, the endless fascination with spores and fronds, and the way it all wove itself into the fabric of Victorian life. It was more than a fad. It was a living, breathing culture full of passion, patience, and yes, just a hint of polite drama. Historians still argue whether the fern craze was a gentle retreat from modern life or a subtle form of social resistance. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was something more, a reminder that even in the most controlled and constrained of times, life finds a way to unfurl in unexpected beauty. As you watch the fronds curl and stretch toward the light, you feel a deep connection, not just to the plants themselves, but to the people who came before you, who nurtured this quiet obsession with care and devotion. You are part of that lineage now, a keeper of green secrets in a world that moves too fast. You smile softly, your fingers tracing the edge of a delicate fern leaf, feeling the tiny ridges and veins beneath your touch. Outside, the rain continues to fall, gentle and steady, washing away the noise of the day. Here in this quiet corner of the world, everything is calm. Everything is green. Everything is alive. And that, dear listener, is where we leave our story tonight. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the peaceful night together. Now, slow your breath. Feel the quiet seep into your bones like the soft dampness of forest moss beneath your fingertips. The day's worries, the world's clamor, they all fade, replaced by the gentle hush of leaves, unfurling of spores drifting in invisible dances. Imagine yourself in that Victorian conservatory once more, the air warm and thick with the scent of earth and growing things. The glass panes catch the fading light, casting a soft glow on every delicate frond, each one a testament to patience and quiet resilience. You listen to the faint drip of water, the rustle of leaves, and the soft sigh of the wind teasing the edges of your world. You don't need to rush. There is no hurry here. Time slows. The fragile, curling fiddleheads remind you that growth is a slow, steady unfolding, and that beauty often blooms in shadowed corners. As your eyelids grow heavy, know this: beneath the noise and haste of the world, life always finds a way to unfurl with grace. The Victorian fern obsession wasn't just about plants. It was about finding a still point, a quiet moment to breathe and simply be. So let yourself drift, carried by the whisper of leaves and the calm embrace of the night. Good night, dear listener. Sweet dreams.